Alright, hello everybody and welcome back to another Bentley Davy Tutors video. Today, this is the big one. This is the full analysis of Julius Caesar. So obviously, if you've managed to actually make it into the video, I'm very thankful for that. You probably saw the little timestamp in the bottom corner and thought, oh God, I do not want to watch this video because it is far too long. But I promise we're here to help you, and I'm going to help you get through this video so that you actually know what you need from it and you don't have to watch the whole thing. So obviously, today I'll be analysing the entirety of Julius Caesar, and so I'm going to go through act by act and scene by scene analysis of every scene of the entire play, which is why this video is so long, with quotes for all of those scenes, as well as the main events of the scene, characters involved, and just general context. So that's sort of how I'm going to structure that. But obviously you don't want to watch this entire 2-hour video, and that makes sense. It's far too long to watch. So what I'm going to recommend that you do is skip to the scenes that are actually going to matter for you. So if you do happen to want to watch this entire video because you want a full analysis, full credit to you, that would be incredible. We'd really appreciate that. But if you are somebody who maybe has an exam or an essay coming up in the next few days who really just needs an in-depth analysis to get some quotes, but you don't need to see an analysis of the entire play, this is what you're going to need to do. So you're going to need to skip to the scenes that are actually going to matter for you. So these scenes, and I'm going to have chapters in the video so that you can easily skip ahead, and the links will be in the description to each of those chapters. These scenes that you need to view, in my opinion, the 4 most important scenes in the play. So if you're going to watch any of this video, watch these 4, because you're going to need quotes from these in every essay that you write. Right, first one, Act 1, Scene 2. This is where Cassius convinces Brutus to join the conspiracy. This is very important. You'll need quotes from there. Second one, Act 3, Scene 1. This is where Caesar actually dies, so you'll need quotes from there as well. Thirdly, the most important scene in the entire play, Act 3, Scene 2. This is the funeral oration scene, and it's going to be the bulk of your essay, really. So absolutely, you have to watch that scene. And then finally, Act 4, Scene 1, which is the prescription scene, and is also very important if you're ever arguing anything about moral flexibility, which you most likely will be. So if you are not wanting a full analysis of everything, which I would expect most of you don't, that's completely fair enough. I've been sitting here for days writing these notes, and I really haven't enjoyed it either. So I don't blame you for not wanting a full analysis. So if you're going to skip to any of those scenes, skip to each of them, and just you can sit down and watch them for a bit, and I will give you multiple quotes. I mean, Act 3, Scene 2, which is the funeral oration scene, I've included 45 quotes with analysis for each of them. So if you're really looking for quotes and you're stuck for quotes, go to each of those scenes and you'll get the quotes there that you need. So I hope that's helpful. I would also recommend going along with a script. This is my script here, so that you can easily sort of follow through and at least just sort of have in your mind where the quotes are when I say them. If it also helps, you can highlight them when I say them or mark them down so that you can then go back and write down the analysis of that quote if you're planning on using it. Finally, I'm going to be sitting here recording, obviously, for quite a long time. So I've just got some water with me. So if you see me taking sips of water, I'm sorry, I hope that's okay. But I'm going to be here for a while. So yeah, that's why I've got some water. But we'll get into it. So for each of the scenes of the play, some scenes I skip or I give just a little synopsis of the scene because they're not that important. What I'll do is I'll go through a summary of the scene, this being the main events of the scene, the characters involved, and then any context that's important at the time, and then all of the important quotes from that scene. So every scene's got like at least 5 or 6 quotes. Some of them have upwards of 30 or 40. And so I hope they will all be helpful in your analysis of the play. So we're going to start obviously with Act 1, Scene 1, and we'll move all the way through to Act 5, Scene 5. So here we go. Hope you enjoy the video, and I'll get straight into it. All right, so Act 1, Scene 1. So let's go for the main events of the scene. So this is the opening scene of the play. However, at first glance, it might not seem actually that important for being the opening scene of this play. But what essentially happens here is that Morellus and Flavius, who I'll run over in a second, they're out in the streets of Rome. So they see that there are workers out in the street celebrating something, and they ask these workers why they're out in the street. They reply that they've come to celebrate Caesar, who's come home from being happening overseas. And Morellus and Flavius basically get really mad at them and highlight the fact that just a few weeks ago they were out celebrating Pompey, and now they are celebrating the guy who has just killed Pompey. So the main point of this scene is to show the fickle nature of the people of Rome. So in terms of the characters involved, we've got Morellus, who is a tribune. Tribune is an elected official who is meant to represent the wishes of the plebeians, who are sort of the general people of Rome. Flavius is also a tribune, and similar to Morellus. Then we have a big character here who's the cobbler. He's a man on the street who works as a cobbler, who's like a shoe repairer, but who also provides a bit of backchat to Morellus. We then have Caesar, who is only really mentioned as opposed to actually being in the scene, but is the focus of the scene. Finally, we have Pompey, who is the previous ruler of Rome, who is equally mentioned in the scene, but isn't actually in the scene. He's now dead, so that makes sense. So the context at the time here, so Caesar has just defeated Pompey in the Roman Civil War and has returned to Rome to receive his triumph, which is like a parade basically to symbolize your victory. So the people of Rome have called a holiday and taken the day off work to celebrate, but the tribunes, who are the people who are elected to represent the people of Rome, aren't all that happy about it. All right, so let's go through some quotes and analysis. So firstly, we see that Morellus and Flavius attempt to talk to the people about their working. Is this a holiday? What? Know you not being mechanical? So Flavius asks the men on the street why they aren't working, and he's interrogative here by saying, like, is this a holiday? Why aren't you working? And then we see Morellus ask one of the men on the street, but what trade art thou? And the cobbler responds with, a trade, sir, which I hope I may use in safe conscience, which is indeed a mender of bad souls. Here we see paronomasia, or a pun, being used by the cobbler. Obviously, a cobbler is somebody who fixes shoes, or bad soles, as in the sole of your shoe. But in this case, he actually is speaking about bad souls, like a person's soul, and he's trying to say that Morellus has a bad soul. He then says, yet if you be out, sir, I can mend you. So the cobbler then offers to mend Morellus's soul. He's saying it like the shoe, but he actually means his like soul inside him. So this line highlights the fact that the people see the tribunes, who are meant to represent them, as people with bad souls. They essentially don't like them, which shows the major disconnect between the people and the people who are meant to represent the people, which obviously is not something that we want. So now we see the Morellus and Flavius talk to the people about why they're actually celebrating. So then it says, but indeed, sir, we make holiday to see Caesar and rejoice in his triumph. So the cobbler here speaks honestly to Morellus and explains that all the people have taken the day off the day off of work to rejoice in Caesar's triumph. And so Morellus says, wherefore rejoice? What conquest brings he home? What tributaries follow him to Rome? So Morellus balks at the idea that they've all taken the day off and questions what Caesar is actually bringing back to Rome. He's not really bringing anything that Morellus thinks is all that good. He's brought no great riches or anything all that worth celebrating. Now, the most important quote of this scene, and something you might actually use, Morellus then says, you blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. So if you take anything out of this scene, take out this quote. So Morellus directly calls the people fickle. So when he says he calls them blocks and stones, he means like building blocks or things that can easily be moved around. And so for in this case, the people have been moved from supporting Caesar to now, from supporting Pompey to now supporting Caesar. And then another quote which supports this is where they say, and now do you put on your best attire? And now do you cull out a holiday? And now do you strew flowers in his way? In his way that comes in triumph over great Pompey's blood. So here we see Morellus gets really mad. He basically tries to beat the people with logic here. He says, with repeated rhetorical questions, there's your nice technique. It's also a tricolon, because there's 3 of them. But he says, Pompey did all this great stuff, and you all loved it. But now Caesar has killed Pompey, and you take all of this time to celebrate him. And he's saying, well, why are you doing this? When you celebrated Pompey before, now you're happy that he's dead. But that's Act 1, Scene 1. Now we'll move on to Act 1, Scene 2. So hopefully you've gotten sort of a gist of how these are going to work. Some of these scenes are obviously shorter. Some of them are a lot longer. But it sort of goes through like that. So, Act 1, Scene 2. The main events of the scene, so we see that Caesar and his progression will move through the streets and encounter the soothsayer. Cassius will speak to Brutus about the conspiracy. Caesar and Antony will discuss the threat of Cassius. And Cassius and Brutus will speak with Casca about the crown. So the characters involved here are Caesar, Antony, Brutus, Cassius, Casca, and the soothsayer. So in terms of the context at the time, it's right before the Feast of the Lupercal. Basically, Caesar and his procession roll through the streets and a whole lot of stuff happens. All right. So let's look at some quotes and analysis here. So firstly, with Caesar and his procession moving through the streets and encountering the soothsayer, Antony makes a nice quote here at the start where he says, I do recall when Caesar says, do this, it is performed. So Caesar asks something of Antony, and basically Antony comments that when Caesar tells somebody to do something, it gets done. So this is the main hint that we see at Caesar's arrogance. The next quote here is, beware the Ides of March. This is a pretty famous quote that you may have heard. Might not actually be that important for any of your essays, but basically a soothsayer, who is somebody who can supposedly tell the truth, comes up to the group and tells Caesar to beware the Ides of March, which is equivalent to the 15th of March if Caesar were to live today. And this happens to be the day that Caesar will die, but he's not all that worried about this at that present time. Caesar responds by saying, he is a dreamer, let him pass. So this is where Caesar once again shows his arrogance and oversight and chooses to ignore the soothsayer, dismissing him as a dreamer. He, like many other times in the play, chooses to ignore the warning signs that he's in danger, even though he's managed to see them. Okay, so our next main thing that happens in this scene is that Cassius speaks to Brutus about his conspiracy. This obviously being the conspiracy to kill Caesar. So this is where most of your quotes from this scene will come from. They're all quite good. This is, I think, one of the scenes that I recommended in the intro to watch. So these are the main quotes that you want to look out for. So firstly, then that poor Brutus with himself at war. So Cassius had commented to Brutus that he had seen a little bit off lately, and Brutus metaphorically replies that he's been with himself at war. This symbolizes his internal conflict, which will continue further throughout the play. Next we have, where many of the best respect in Rome, except immortal Caesar, wished that noble Brutus had his eyes. Here's the start of an extended metaphor of eyes and mirrors, which are interchangeable. And the idea here is that Cassius is saying that many of the most respected people in Rome, except for Caesar, wish that Brutus had his eyes. Also, this, obviously swapped out for mirrors, which means that they want him to see the nobility in himself, as in they want him to see that he is better than Caesar. Then Brutus responds by saying, into what dangers would you lead me, Cassius? So Brutus picks up on the fact that something's a little bit off with what Cassius is saying, and asks him what dangers, as in what bad things, he's being led into. So after Brutus hears the crowd cheering, he says, I do fear that people choose Caesar as their king. So he says that he fears that Caesar has been crowned, and then he rolls with that. So Cassius responds with, do you fear it? Then must I think you would not have it so. So Cassius is a bit slimy here and basically says, well, if you fear that they've crowned him, then I guess you don't want Caesar to be king. And then he basically takes that forward. And then so Brutus says, for let the gods so speed me because I love the name of honor more than I fear death. This is a lovely little quote here which hints to his rigid idealism, where he basically says that, you know what, I don't care about the dangers that you're going to lead me into anymore because I love honor more than I fear death. And I'm more worried about doing what's honorable than doing something that could kill me. So then Cassius gives a number of little stories of Caesar, which basically try and make him seem weak. So he says, Caesar cried, help me, Cassius, or I sink. So Cassius gives Brutus two examples of anamnesis, which is like a flashback, which is where he will tell a story from the past. In this one, he explains that he had to save Caesar from drowning when they were away in the ocean. And then he also says next that he had a fever when he was in Spain. In this one, Cassius presents Caesar as being weak by explaining that he got deathly ill on their trip to Spain, and he described Caesar as a sick girl. In both cases, Cassius attempts to portray Caesar as a weak person who doesn't deserve to be raised above everyone else. Cassius then backs this up by saying, why man he doth bestride the narrow world as a colossus. He says here, and he expresses his anger, that Caesar is able to go through the world and be portrayed as a god, even though as he's just showed, Caesar is just as weak as anybody else. Cassius then says, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. This is another nice quote from this scene. And this slide speaks about fate and how Cassius, and it gives Cassius's motives for the conspiracy. So he says that they are below Caesar because they've chosen to be. It's not the fault of fate. It's not in their stars. It's in themselves. It's because they chose to be under Caesar. This means that Cassius has the attitude that the only person that can make him not be an underling to Caesar is Cassius himself. So that's what he does. He comes up with the conspiracy. And then he says, why should that name be sounded more than yours? Write them together, yours is as fair a name. And so this is once again trying to appeal to that idea for Brutus that Cassius is trying to make sure that he knows that Caesar isn't any better than him, and there's no reason why Caesar should be elevated. So Cassius is basically saying, if you wrote Caesar and Brutus as names next to each other, Caesar shouldn't be sounded more than Brutus. they're both as fair names. So then next thing is that Caesar and Antony discuss Cassius. So this is rather short, but basically Caesar says, "Yon Cassius has such a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous." So Caesar here says to Antony that Cassius is considered dangerous, and he uses synecdoche, which is where you represent the whole of something by one part, to show that Cassius's mean look represents him as a mean person in general. And he says that his thinking makes him dangerous. Antony tells Caesar and responds that Cassius is not scary. But then Caesar responds to this by saying, "I rather tell thee what is feared than what I fear, for always I am Caesar." This is again Caesar's arrogance. He's basically saying, no, I wasn't telling you what I'm scared of. I'm not telling you what I'm scared of. I'm telling you what you should be scared of. I'm Caesar. I don't need to get scared. And then finally, we see that Cassius and Brutus speak to Casca about what happened with the crown. So they say, was the crown offered him thrice? Where Brutus asked Casca if the crown was offered to Caesar 3 times. And Casca responds with, "I marry was't," and he put it by thrice, every time gentler than the other. So Casca explains that Antony offered Caesar the crown 3 times, and each time he had the people's support to take the crown. But each time he denied it, and with more and more emphasis. Now the important part here is that Caesar made a spectacle of it. Not necessarily that he was just offered the crown, but that he made sure that the people knew that he maybe wanted the crown, but he just wasn't willing to take it there. Finally, we have Act 1, Scene 3, which isn't a super long or super important scene, but that will end off Act 1. So the main events of the scene, basically Casca and Cicero and Cassius discuss the conspiracy. So they start this off by speaking about the omens that they have seen, and they also give the suggestion that these omens are all portents from the gods, that they are doing the wrong thing. This often happens with the interruption of the divine right of kings, as we know from Macbeth. Then they gloss over that and explain how they need to get Brutus's support for the conspiracy, and that's the only way that it will work. And so they choose to write a letter to Brutus, pretending to be the people, so that Brutus thinks, oh, well, the people of Rome want me to kill Caesar, so I must join in the conspiracy. Because obviously this is Brutus appealing to what the people want and trying to do the honourable thing. So the characters involved here are Casca, Cassius, and Cicero. And so the context at the time is that the three meet up after Cassius has attempted to convince Brutus for the first time, and the group recognise the importance of Brutus to their conspiracy in maintaining public support. And so they put specific focus on convincing him, deciding to write the letters. So firstly, we have that Casca and Cicero discuss the portents, and so these are the main quotes from the scene that are actually really important to you. But they start by saying, are you not moved when all the sway of the earth shakes like a thing unfirm? So Casca asks Cicero if he isn't worried about what Casca clearly thinks are omens. Cicero says he hasn't seen them, and so asks if there were any more. Casca says that a common slave held up his left hand, which did flame and burn, and yet his hand, not sensible of fire, remained unscorched. So the first omen that Casca points out is that a man had held up his hand, which was literally on fire, but the fire didn't burn his hand and it remained largely untouched. The next omen that he points out is that against the Capitol I met a lion who glared upon me and went surly by, without annoying me. So this second omen is a lion which essentially walks through the Capitol, but doesn't hurt anyone. So interesting links can be drawn here to this maybe being a symbol of Caesar. He is Machiavelli's lion, and in this case, he walks through the capital of Rome without disturbing anyone. He doesn't do wrong by the people, which is the same as Caesar. The third omen is that a heap 100 ghastly women, transformed with their fear, who swore they saw men all in fire walk up and down the streets. So omen 3 is a group of women who were lying on the street and crying out that they saw men walking around on fire. And then our final omen is, and yesterday the bird of the night did sit, even at noonday upon the marketplace, hooting and shrieking. So the fourth and final omen is an owl which remains out in the marketplace during the day, which obviously an owl wouldn't do. And so finally they say, for I believe they are portentous things unto the climate they point upon. So Casca finally says that he believes that these are all portents or omens from the gods, which reflect on the disorder about to occur in the natural world. Essentially, they recognize that the gods don't want them to take part in the conspiracy. They don't really listen to this though, and they decide to go along with it anyway. So that is Act 1. I think we've done well there. Those are all of the scenes for Act 1. We'll obviously move on to Act 2 now. We've got 2 scenes for Act 2, these being obviously Scene 1 and Scene 2. And so I'll move into... Alright, so Act 2, Scene 1. This is a bit of a whopper of a scene. Not not too much, but there's a few different things that happen. So, firstly, Brutus will deliver his snake soliloquy. Brutus will then read the letter from the people that we spoke about in the previous scene. Brutus and the conspirators will speak about their plan, and then Portia will question Brutus on what he is planning to do. So, in terms of our characters involved, we have Brutus, Lucius, who is a servant of Brutus, who we don't really see that much throughout the rest of the play, Portia, Cassius, and then the other conspirators. So in terms of the context of the time, this is the opening of the second act and flows directly on from the conspirators deciding to write the letter to Brutus from the people. In this scene, Brutus decides that he must kill Caesar and then reads the aforementioned letter. He then meets with the conspirators to discuss their plans. So firstly, we're going to have a bit of a look at Brutus's snake soliloquy. So we've got some full notes on that here. So the whole thing with Brutus here is that he foresees that that Caesar may turn bad if he's crowned, not that he's bad now. So he says, to begin, he says, it must be by his death, and for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him. So Brutus himself has no reason to kill Caesar at the moment, but he believes that Rome does. He doesn't want to kill his friend because Caesar's one of his very good friends, but he believes, but for the general good of Rome, he must. So Brutus tells us that Caesar has to die for the general Roman Republic, as opposed to any personal issues that Brutus may have with Caesar, which aren't really very many because they're very good friends. So he then says, it is the bright day that brings forth the adder. So Brutus foresees Caesar being an issue for him and saying the bright, this being the good times happening at the moment, are what brings forward the bad things. So this is the start of the extended metaphor and the zoomorphism of Caesar being a snake, and we'll see that continue throughout the soliloquy. So crown him that, and then I grant we put a sting in him. So Brutus says if Caesar gets the crown, he believes this could put a sting in him, which would then obviously prompt him to turn bad if he's crowned. So they must get him before then and kill him essentially. And so then we have a nice quote here, which is, but when he attains the utmost round, unto the ladder he turns his back, scorning the base degrees from which he did ascend. So this is a nice comment on ambition from Brutus. So he suggests that ambition is a ladder, and everybody climbs up it, and Caesar climbs it with the others. But when Caesar reaches the top rung, this is him being crowned, obviously, he will turn his back on those who he was climbing with, and he will scorn the base degrees. Essentially, he will scorn the people below him from the top. Then we see, and therefore think of him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would, as his kind, grow mischievous. So this is the continuation of the snake extended metaphor, where Brutus suggests that Caesar is a snake, which, when hatched from its egg, would, like other snakes of its kind, grow evil, and that must be stopped. So he then says, and kill him in the shell. So Brutus reasons that he must kill Caesar in his shell before he goes bad as a preventative measure. And obviously this continues the snake metaphor here. So the soliloquy essentially portrays Brutus as a leader who isn't willing to go far enough. He'll make a half-baked decision but won't go all the way. So this is similar to when Cassius then asked Brutus to kill Antony, which we'll see in the future, but Brutus says no. So Brutus's reasoning for killing Caesar is that he says that Caesar is like a snake in an egg. When he grows up, he will turn evil like the other snakes, and this is also paralleled in the metaphor of the ladder. But he's not necessarily evil now. So thus, Brutus presents killing Caesar as necessary as a preventative measure. Now, a key note also here is that what we see is that Cassius's persuasion of Brutus in the previous scene, or in 2 scenes ago, wasn't actually what convinces him. So Cassius focuses on Caesar being a weak person, both in spirit and physically. Caesar being a weak person who, because he's the same as everybody else, doesn't deserve to be raised above them. But Brutus doesn't really seem to care about that. Brutus is friends with Caesar, and so probably didn't really have many issues with that. But Brutus decides instead that Caesar should die because of the potential of his threat, not anything to do with Caesar being weak. Cassius seemingly just planted the idea in Brutus's mind, but his arguments didn't actually matter. So now we see Brutus reading the letter. So the first quote here is, Brutus, thou sleepest, awake and see thyself, speak, strike, redress. So the letter, while short, has direct instructions for Brutus. It says he has slept, as in he has ignored the threat of Caesar for too long, and now he must awaken. We also see the tricolon of speak, strike, redress, which tells Brutus that he must speak out, strike Caesar, and then the redress will follow. Then Brutus says, O Rome, I make thee promise, if redress will follow, thou receivest my full petition at the hand of Brutus. Brutus reacts very positively to the letter, essentially saying that he makes the decision that if there will be redress to follow for Rome, then he is happy to kill Caesar. This shows his willingness to do something if and only if he can justify it to himself as being something moral. This is apostrophe in terms of the technique because it's addressing something that's not that's like an inanimate object, this being, in this case, Rome. So then Brutus says, since Cassius first whet me to Caesar, whet being spelt there W-H-E-T, as in whetting a knife, he says, I have not slept. So Brutus explains that his internal moral conflict is continuing, and he has not been able to sleep because he still hasn't been sure what to do. There's also paranomasia in terms of where he says whet, this being a pun here, as in told me about, but also whet as in what you do to sharpen a knife. And obviously Caesar will get killed by knives. So then he says, between the acting of the dreadful thing and the first motion, all the interim is like a phantasma or a hideous dream. This is another hint to his internal conflict, and he explains that the liminal space between making the decision to kill Caesar and actually doing it, all that time in between is terrible for him because he's sort of thinking over and over in his head, oh, was that right? Is this the right decision? What's going on? So now we see that Brutus talks to himself about the conspiracy. So he says, where wilt thou find a cavern dark enough to mask thy monstrous visage? Seek none's conspiracy, hide in smiles and affability. So Brutus uses apostrophe and directly addresses the conspiracy as a thing, saying don't hide in a cave, instead hide behind a smile and prevent being seen. He then says, not Erebus itself were dim enough to hide thee from prevention. So Brutus here literally says that not even hell would be dark enough to hide the conspirators from being caught if they didn't hide behind a smile. So Brutus's main decision here and his main message for the conspirators is that they must hide behind their smiles and they must present themselves as nice, fun people while actually continuing the conspiracy in the background. So then we see that Brutus and the conspirators talk. So the conspirators suggest an oath and basically where they say, and let us swear our resolution, but Brutus gets a bit unhappy with that. He says, no, not an oath. And then he says, if these motives be weak, break off bedtimes and every man hence to his idle bed. He says that if their motives aren't strong enough that they need an oath, then they should just all go home and not actually do it. And he says, do not stain the even virtue of our enterprise, nor the insuppressive metal of our spirits. So this is parodia stole, which is where he turns a vice into a virtue, so turning a bad thing into a good thing, where he says the even virtue of our enterprise, he's basically saying the even virtue, he's saying that the act of killing Caesar is something that he can turn into something virtuous. Then he says every drop of blood that every Roman bears and nobly bears is guilty of several bastardy if he do break the smallest particle of any promise that hath passed from him. So Brutus here says that every drop of blood in every noble Roman would be proven to not be Roman if they break a single particle of any promise that they made aloud. Essentially, any noble Roman won't break a promise, so they don't need an oath. Now we see that Cassius suggests that Antony should be killed. He says, let Antony and Caesar fall together. Cassius expresses that he wants to kill Antony as well as Caesar because it's not fit that somebody so well beloved of Caesar should outlive him. But Brutus responds and says, our cause will seem too bloody, for Antony is but a limb of Caesar. So Brutus again doesn't like this idea and denies it, saying that Antony can't do anything when Caesar is gone. He's like a body without a head. The quote here is, for he can do no more than Caesar's arm when Caesar's head is off. He basically says that the cause will seem too bloody, they'll seem too evil if they kill Antony as well as Caesar. He backs this up by saying, let us be butchers, not sacrificers. Let us kill him boldly, but not wrathfully. Let's carve him as a dish fit for the gods, not hew him as a carcass fit for the hounds. This is 3 more examples of parodia stole, where they want to present their enterprise as virtuous, which means that they can't go over the top or they will lose public support. Finally, we see that in this scene, Brutus talks to Portia, who's his wife, and so this is in response to the snake soliloquy that Brutus gives. So she starts by saying, is Brutus sick, and is it physical to walk unbraced and suck up the humours of the dank morning? So Portia has noticed basically that Brutus has been getting up in the morning and walking around, and so Portia notices and can see Brutus's internal conflict. Cassius can spot this too, as we saw. Machiavelli tells us that a good leader will be able to be decisive and make full effort decisions, and an internal conflict from Brutus shows us that he's making a half-baked decision and he's not able to stand by himself. We see Portia say, and will he steal out of his wholesome bed to dare the vile contagion of the night? Once again, Portia is asking Brutus, she almost interrogates him here, why he's up at night. She knows he's not sick, she knows he's conflicted. And then she says, and what men tonight have had to resort to you, for there have been some 6 or 7 who did hide their faces even from darkness. So Portia understands that the conspirators are coming to their home and that there's something dodgy going on. And she's hinting to Brutus about it because she wants him to tell her what's going on. There's also a nice quote here about the conspirators saying who did hide their faces even from darkness. Finally, we see that Portia says, "And upon my knees I charm you by my once commanded beauty, by all your vows of love, and that great vow which did incorporate and make us one, that you unfold to me." So this is just a quote basically about their wedding vows, but she says, I doubt anybody would ever use it, but she says, you should tell me what's going on and what you're planning because we're married, essentially. So that's everything for Act 2, Scene 1. We've sort of blitzed through that. It was a bit long, I'm sure, but that's a pretty good scene, a pretty big scene. So I hope you were able to take some nice things out of that. All right, Act 2, Scene 2. This one's a nice bit shorter. The main events of the scene here, we see that Caesar, Calpurnia, and a servant talk about the omens that they've seen and whether Caesar should go out to the Senate. And then we have that Brutus convinces Caesar to come to the Senate. So the characters involved here are Caesar, Calpurnia, who is Caesar's wife, a servant of Caesar, Brutus, and some of the other senators. So in terms of the context of at the time of the scene, overnight Calpurnia has called out in her sleep, and we also see that there were weather omens everywhere, and they sent out an augur who is basically like a religious person at the time who was able to go and do like sacrifices and then read the intestines of the animal that was sacrificed to see if it's like a good or bad sign. Not the most scientific thing, but that's what they ran with at the time. So the augur finds even more omens because they sacrifice a beast and it doesn't even have a heart. So everything is saying that Caesar shouldn't go into the Senate, but he does anyway because Brutus is able to convince him. All right, so the quotes and analysis for this scene. Firstly, we have Caesar and Calpurnia discussing whether Caesar should basically go into work. So the scene opens with thunder and lightning, which we know is another common weather omen from Shakespeare's plays. It shows that basically bad things will happen. So it starts with Caesar saying, "Thrice hath Calpurnia cried in her sleep. Help ho, they murder Caesar." So Calpurnia has been dreaming that Caesar will be killed and cries out 3 times, this obviously being an omen. And then Caesar says, "Go bid the priests do present sacrifice and bring me their opinion of success." Caesar is once again skeptical of what's going on, and so he asks the priests to go out and do a sacrifice, which an augur will then read the intestines of and tell them if it's good or bad news. Calpurnia says to Caesar, "You shall not stir out of your house today." Calpurnia says that Caesar shouldn't leave the house and is set on that fact. So Caesar responds by saying, "Caesar shall forth, when they shall see the face of Caesar, they are vanished." So there's major Iliism here, which is where you refer to yourself in the third person. And we also see more of Caesar's arrogance, where he basically says he doesn't need to worry because anything dangerous will vanish when it sees Caesar's face. And so Calpurnia responds by saying, "The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes." Calpurnia here says that basically the heavens are telling him that he will die. But then Caesar responds by saying, "Cowards die many times before their death." So this is a nice quote by Caesar showing his arrogance. He basically says it would be cowardly not to come out, and he says that arguably being a coward is worse than dying. So then we see that the augur returns, and the augur says that they could not find a heart within the beast. So the augur had made a sacrifice and said that the animal, when they sacrificed it, did not have a heart in it. Obviously, this is a terrible omen for Caesar, and the augur presently says that he should not go out. So then Caesar says, "Danger knows full well that Caesar is more dangerous than he. We are 2 lions littered in one day." There's more Iliism here where Caesar mentioned himself in the third person, but there's also a whole lot more arrogance. Caesar basically says that he is brothers with danger, but danger knows that Caesar is more dangerous than danger itself. Calpurnia responds and hits back at him by saying, your wisdom is consumed in confidence. Calpurnia can see through this, and basically she's able to say that his confidence is getting too much for him here, and he's being an idiot and ignoring the warning signs. So then Brutus comes to take Caesar to the Senate. Caesar doesn't really want to go, but is then convinced. So we have a nice quote here where Caesar says, "And we, like friends, will straight away go together." So Caesar says, "Let's go in to the Senate house and have some wine." He says they are like friends. He uses the term like here as in like terms in maths. So he's saying they are the same. They are like-minded. They think alike. So he says, "We like friends." Brutus responds by saying that every like is not the same, O Caesar. The heart of Brutus yearns to hear it. Now here Brutus uses more paronomasia, which is a pun, obviously play on words, to change the meaning of like. So Brutus is saying here that they are like friends, as in they look like friends and they seem like friends, but they're not friends. As in that colour is like the other colour, but it's different. So as we can see in the first one, Caesar says like friends, as in we're like-minded people, we're getting along well, we're like the same. But then Brutus says Brutus uses the other meaning of like, and he says, we are like friends, as in we're close to friends, but we're not, because Brutus is actually planning to kill him. Anyway, so that is that scene done and that act done. So we will move swiftly on to Act 3. This is the most important act of the play, and certainly is the longest act for me to go through, because we've got the first 2 scenes here are absolutely crucial, and scene 3 is very important as well. So obviously, yeah, we've got 3 scenes for Act 3, and these are the ones where you really want to listen up and take down the quotes, because there's loads of them here that are going to be very helpful for basically any essay that you write. So I will go through that now, and we'll start off with Act 3, Scene 1. All right, Act 3, Scene 1. Here we go. Main events of the scene. So we see that Caesar is incredibly arrogant in discussions with the soothsayer and subsequently the senators. Then we see that Caesar is killed by the conspirators, but they lack a plan. We then see that Antony gets the opportunity to have his oration. And then we have that Antony immediately backtracks on his deal. So the characters involved here are all the conspirators: Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, and Antony. So we have a big bit of context here. So at the start of the scene, Caesar finds the soothsayer, the one from the start, out in the streets, and has an argument with him on the way to the Senate. Artemidorus, who is a senator, attempts to provide Caesar with a bill for the Senate, saying he should read it first because it concerns Caesar himself. Caesar tells him that it can wait until they move inside. The conspirators went inside, begged Caesar to repeal the sentence of Publius Cimber, who had been exiled, and Caesar denies their request and gets mad at them for attempting to flatter him. They then stab him, and Antony then runs home because he's scared and sends his servant back to ask if he can come and speak to the conspirators in person, or if when he gets there, they will kill him. When he gets back, because obviously they said that they won't kill him and he can go speak to them. When he gets there, he asks if he can speak at the funeral of Caesar and pretends to be friends with them. He then gets what he wants, and when they all leave, he goes down to Caesar's body and backtracks on everything he just said to Brutus and Cassius and plots how he will betray them. So obviously that was quite a lot, but that's just a summary of how the scene works. So firstly, this is Caesar leading his procession through the streets to the Senate. So Caesar first finds the soothsayer and says to him, "The Ides of March hath come," but then the soothsayer responds, "I, Caesar, but not gone." So Caesar attempts to argue with the soothsayer, saying, "Look, it's the Ides of March, and I'm fine, I'm still here." But the soothsayer reminds him that while it is the Ides of March, it's not over yet, and he's still got very much an opportunity to be in trouble. Then he says, after Artemidorus offers him a bill directly apparently addressing Caesar, he says, "What touches us ourselves shall be last served." This doesn't really have a huge amount of importance for the scene, but it's a nice quote to show that Caesar may have not necessarily been a bad guy. It may have been quite good for the people, because it's evidence that he's not really selfish and he's happy to deal with the people's interests first. So we now see that Caesar's party moves into the Senate and the conspirators attempt to flatter him. This is most of the quotes in the scene, but it's pretty good here. So we see most high, most mighty, and most puissant Caesar. So Marellus Cimber here uses a tricolon of epithets to try and flatter Caesar. He wants his brother to be set free from exile, but really this is just a distraction. Caesar responds by saying, "I must prevent these, Cimber. These couchings and these lowly courtesies might fire the blood of ordinary men." So this is where Caesar begins his major arrogance. In his response to the flattery, he claims that their flattery may be able to convince ordinary men, but he is no ordinary man. He then says, "If thou dost bend and pray and fawn for him, I spurn thee like a cur out of my way. No Caesar doth not wrong, nor without cause." So Caesar now says, "If you flatter me more, I will throw you out of my way like a cur," which is a dog. And the second half of the quote is Caesar referring to the fact that he doesn't do wrong, nor does he do things without a reason. So he's claiming that banishing Publius was not the wrong thing to do, and he had a reason to do it. So he then says, "I could be well moved if I were as you." This is similar to the previous one, and this is a direct result of Cassius's flattery, and this is basically a direct diss on Cassius. So he says, "If I were weak like you, then this flattery would work on me, but because I'm really cool and I'm not weak like you, it doesn't work." So he then delivers probably his best quote of the whole scene, especially for these points, is, "But I am as constant as the northern star, of whose true fixed resting quality there is no further a fellow in the firmament." So this is a key quote all about Caesar's arrogance, and he claims that he's like the northern star. This is a star which doesn't move, and all other stars move around it. He basically says he's the center of all, and there are no others like him. This is a big extended metaphor which continues also throughout the rest of the scene. He then says, "They are all fire, and everyone doth shine, but there's one in all doth hold his place. so in the world. So this is a continuation of that extended metaphor. He says there are plenty of stars and they all shine, but none shine as brightly as the northern star. And he also says this is true in the world, with obviously him being the brightest. And he ends this off by saying, hence wilt thou lift up Olympus. So Olympus is the home of the gods, and Caesar now compares himself to the home of the gods. He says, would you try and lift up or beg or flatter the gods? No, you wouldn't. So why do you do it to me? Then Caesar is killed. Casca says, speak hands for me, which is basically when he asks his hands to speak for him. And it's sort of like, this is a bit of a confusing quote, but he's basically saying, instead of actually speaking anything, his hands will represent his feelings towards Caesar. Obviously, his hands stabbing him. Then we see the very famous quote, et tu, Brute, which is where Caesar sees that Brutus is going to stab him as well. But then the second half of the quote is, then falls Caesar. So the full quote is, et tu, Brute, then falls Caesar. So et tu in French or Latin is and you. So he's saying, and you, Brutus, then falls Caesar. So this is the main act of betrayal that we see in the play. Caesar trusts and loves Brutus so much, so when he sees that even Brutus wants him dead, he seems to accept the fact that he needs to die, and then decides to fall. So then immediately after his death, the conspirators cry, liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead. They're very happy because they've killed Caesar, but this pretty quickly turns into something not that great. So we see that happens because the group basically don't have a plan. We have some nice quotes here where we see, go to the pulpit, Brutus, and Cassius too, where's Publius? So the conspirators are hastily trying to work out what to do, and they don't really know where people are. They didn't, they didn't think any further ahead than Caesar actually dying. So then Brutus gets up on the pulpit and says to the people of Rome who are there at the Senate house, he says, so we are Caesar's friends that have abridged his time of fearing death. Again, they have no plan here. The immediate defense that they give to the people and the immediate explanation they give to the people as to why they killed Caesar was that they were actually his friends and they're being nice to him because what they've done for him is a nice thing because they've shortened the time that he had to fear death. Obviously, this is a terrible defense. You can't come up and say, oh, I killed somebody, but that's okay because they were scared of dying, so I've just made that time shorter. And then they have the big symbol here, which is and let us bathe our hands in Caesar's blood. Once again, this is very strange and shows clear evidence of a lack of a plan. The only thing they can think to do is bathe their hands in the blood of the man they just killed. So then we have our next thing is that Antony asked to speak at the funeral. So Cassius opens this sort of part of the scene by saying, but yet I have a mind that fears him much. So Cassius says that he fears Antony, and before Antony has even asked anything. And so once again, Cassius can see the signs, but gets ignored and overruled by Brutus. And then so we see that Antony comes over to them and says, if I myself, there is no hour so fit as Caesar's death, as Caesar's death's hour, not an instrument of half the worth as those your swords, made rich with the most noble blood of all this world. So Antony tells them here that if they are going to kill him, do it now. But he also sneaks in nice things about Caesar and saying how much he loves him, and that Caesar's blood is the most noble blood in all of the world. And he's saying that there's no better time to die than the same time as Caesar did. And Brutus responds by saying, though now we must appear bloody and cruel. Brutus says, no, we won't kill you. He returns to his parody at Stowe, saying that they wish to be sacrifices, not butchers here. They want to not seem cruel or bloody. They want to seem like they've made a good decision. So Antony moves on with his dissembling nature here, which is being like deceitful and duplicitous, where he says, let each man render me his bloody hand. This is the start of Antony being duplicitous, and he basically asks to shake the hands of all the conspirators. He now has blood on his hands because they had blood on their hands, and so this is a great way for him to seem like he is with them because it's almost like he's taking some of the blame as well. He then says, friends am I with you all and love you all. Once again, he claims to be their good friend. Obviously, we're going to see in a second that he's not, but he claims to be. He then asks Brutus, he says, that's all I seek, that I may produce his body to the marketplace and in the pulpit as becomes a friend, speak in the order of his funeral. Antony issues his request. He says that he wants to present Caesar's body to the marketplace and speak in the funeral. Brutus responds saying, you shall, Mark Antony. He stupidly says yes. So now Cassius gets mad at Brutus and he says, know you how much the people may be moved by that which he will utter. Cassius repeats his concerns from earlier that the people will be moved significantly by what Antony has to say, and Brutus says that he can fix the situation. He says, I will myself into the pulpit first and show the reason of our Caesar's death. Brutus says this will all be okay because he will go into the pulpit himself and he'll do that first, which ends up being a terrible decision. He then says to Antony, you shall not in your funeral speech blame us, but speak all the good you can devise of Caesar. This is once again stupid and says don't blame us, but say nice things about Caesar. Antony completely exploits this, and as we will see in his funeral oration, he never explicitly blames them. Instead, he just says all these things that are so good about Caesar, which then can even do more damage than blaming them would have, because it leads to the point where they come up and they think, well, why have you actually done this? So now our final thing of the scene, which is where Antony speaks to Caesar's body. So here he's all alone, and this is the only time in the play where we see Antony all alone, and we get to see his thoughts. So Antony has just made a deal with Brutus and Cassius that he can stay alive and speak at Caesar's funeral as long as Antony is with them and won't talk against them. Then he completely contradicts this. So he says, "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers." He asks for forgiveness from Caesar, saying that he doesn't actually agree with the conspirators, but he had to agree with them to be performative here. So he says, "Thou art the ruins of the noblest men." Another epithet here saying that he is noble, and he now says, "Over thy wounds now I do prophecy," and this is synecdoche, as he's saying that Caesar's wounds represent the whole of dead Caesar. Then he says, "Which like dumb mouths do ope their ruby lips and beg the voice and utterance of my tongue." Antony already has a plan here. He knows he can convince the people to riot and enrage themselves through his oration. He has this plan. We have already seen the conspirators obviously not having a plan. So we see here that Antony knows what he's doing right from the start. He's pragmatic and foresighted. He actually has a plan. He's an opportunist, embracing both the fox and the lion. So that was the end of Act 3, Scene 1. That is our second last really big one. Next one is going to be huge. That's the funeral oration scene, but I will move on to that now. All right, here we go, everybody. This is a big one. This is Act 3, Scene 2. My notes on this scene are 3,117 words. So this will be good fun. But anyway, this is the most important scene in the play, realistically, in my opinion. It is the funeral orations scene. So if you're going to pay attention to a single scene in this video, I'd make it this one. All right, so main events of the scene. Here we go. So this is the funeral oration scene, essentially the most important scene of the play. Brutus makes his oration, the crowd reacts to his oration, then Antony makes his oration, and then the crowd reacts to that. So the characters involved here are Antony, Brutus, and then some of the plebeians. So in terms of context at the time, Caesar has been killed and these orations take place at his funeral. An oration is a speech given by somebody, usually somebody close to the deceased, at their funeral. In this case, we see a speech given both from Brutus and from Antony, and the result of their speeches ends up with the crowd essentially rioting and screaming through the streets to kill all of the conspirators. Brutus makes a few mistakes here in both his speech and how the funeral runs. These are, firstly, having his speech focus too much on an appeal to logos. So this will become more clear as we move through, but Brutus' speech is mainly focused on appealing to the crowd's sense of logic. This doesn't work that well with a whole bunch of sad people at a funeral. It would be like if you made a speech at a funeral and you had a pros and cons list for the person who had died. That's just not how those sorts of speeches work, and it doesn't work very well on a crowd who's upset. Secondly, his second mistake is that he lets Antony speak. The second issue is that he lets Antony speak at all. Like, he didn't need to do that. There really wasn't all that much point, and it ends up just hurting him. Thirdly, we have the final mistake he makes is letting Antony speak second. So if he really had to let Antony speak, he should really have let him speak first. Antony is able to hear everything that Brutus says and is able to refute it, and he's able to have the last word. Something Brutus really could have done with Antony not having. If you think about it, Brutus has to get up and speak, and then Antony gets to respond to everything that Brutus says, but Brutus doesn't get to respond to anything that Antony says. All right, so let's go into Brutus's oration, and we'll go through, obviously, some quotes and analysis here. So just some quick notes, firstly, for Brutus's oration. So Brutus speaks in prose. So in Shakespeare's plays, the tragic heroes or any characters that are respected or from an upper-class background speak in verse or iambic pentameter. The people who speak in prose are the common people or the characters that have gone mad. For example, Lady Macbeth, when she was sleepwalking, spoke in prose. Brutus here speaks in prose. He does this not really because he's going insane, but he does this to make sure that the people think that he's one of them. The problem here is that the people don't like a leader who is one of them because they say, well, any of us could be ruling then. What makes you so special? So we will take charge instead. Right, so let's start his oration. So he opens by saying, "Hear me for my cause and be silent that you may hear. Brutus opens by asking the crowd to listen and be silent for the justification of his actions that he's about to give. He then says, "Believe me for mine honour, and have respect to mine honour, that you may believe." This quote is an attempt by Brutus to establish his ethos. It's an example of epanalepsis, which is when the sentence is sort of flipped. He says, "Believe me for mine honour," and then he says, "Have respect for mine honour, that you may believe." So obviously you see it's a bit flipped there. But this is also an appeal to ethos. Brutus tries to establish his credibility by saying, "I'm an honourable person, so you should trust me." This is in direct contrast with Antony, and Antony then refutes this later by saying, "No, you should believe me instead, because I was Caesar's best friend." Obviously, Antony's appeal to ethos is far more convincing, because being honourable compared to being somebody's best friend obviously isn't that fair. So then he says, "If there be any in this assembly, any dear friend of Caesar's, to him I say that Brutus's love to Caesar was no less than his." This is one of his first appeals to logic here. And Brutus says, if there's anybody here who loved Caesar, I can tell you that I loved him just as much as you, and therefore what I did was fine. Again, this doesn't really make sense if you think about it. Like, just because you can say that you love somebody as much as somebody else, it doesn't mean that what you've done is necessarily correct. He then says a quote, similarly, he says, "Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more." This is more of an appeal to logic. He says that he's trying to diminish the effect of what he did by saying that he still loved Caesar, he just loved Rome more, so it's okay. He then also appeals to logic and says, "Had you rather Caesar were living and die all slaves than that Caesar were dead to live all free men?" Once again, from Brutus, he isn't doing what you would typically do at a funeral. He's trying to say that, like, if Caesar was still alive, you'd all be here as slaves, and this isn't a good thing. This is not what you do at a funeral. At a funeral with all these grieving people, you'd be nice about the person who's died. And so he's trying to give more justification to the killing rather than actually like appeal to the crowd's sense of emotion in terms of the funeral. He then says, "As Caesar loved me, I wept for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoice at it. As he was valiant, I honour him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him." So this is more of an appeal to logic here. And Brutus sets up a number of good things about Caesar, which contribute to Caesar's characterization, but then crashes them all down, saying that he was ambitious and thus must die. He says, "Who is here so rude that would not be a Roman? If any speak, for him I have offended." This is more of an appeal to logic here, but Brutus essentially asks the crowd two other questions similar to this style. He essentially uses here rhetorical bullying to get the answer out of the crowd. He says, "Who is here so rude who is not a Roman?" He says, "If you don't agree with me, you're basically not a Roman." The crowd responds with, "None, Brutus, none." This tactic actually works fairly well, and the crowd are fairly on board with what he's saying at this point. He says, "As I slew my best lover for the good of Rome, I have the same dagger for myself when it shall please my country to need my death." This is a nice way for Brutus to end here, because he says, "I killed Caesar because he was not good for Rome," and then says, "So if I become not good for Rome as well, I'm happy for you to kill me too." We as the audience see this as dramatic irony, because we know that in the end, he is killed because he becomes not good for Rome. But the crowd respond by saying, "Live, Brutus, live, live." Once again, despite his strange methods to try and convince them, the crowd are somewhat on board. Okay, and I'm back. I had a nice little lunch break, but now I will continue to talk about Act 3, Scene 2. So firstly, let's go into the crowd's reaction to Brutus's oration. So they actually react incredibly positively to Brutus's speech. They say, one of the quotes is, "Give him a statue with his ancestors." They immediately call for a statue of Brutus to be put up. This is something that many people were critical of Caesar for doing, for having statues all around the place, and this shows an immediate shift. They say, "Let him be Caesar." The people have seemingly moved on from Caesar straight away and are now happy for Brutus to replace the dead Caesar. And they say, "Caesar's better parts shall be crowned in Brutus." This is probably the best quote you would use to talk about this part of the oration, but they basically say everything that was good about Caesar exists in Brutus, and thus we should crown him here. A clear shift as well. Now Brutus says, "I do entreat you, not a man depart, save I alone, till Antony have spoke." Brutus says basically here, nobody leave except me until Antony has spoken. This just shows that he's really naive and makes a terrible decision here. If we think about it, not only are the crowd not mad at him for killing Caesar, they're actively praising him and literally want to crown him king. He has their entire support. He could have just left and told Antony, "Sorry mate, but you're not speaking," and then he's got no issues. Instead, he makes everybody stay for Antony's speech. So this shows not only his naivety and his rigid idealism. He's not even willing to say no to Antony, his brutal enemy. So now we get Antony's speech. I mean, I guess at least if Antony gets to speak, we get a whole lot more quotes. So here we go. So we've got some quick notes on Antony's speech. Antony does a much better job at persuading the crowd than Brutus did. He gives a far better appeal to pathos, which is emotion, which is what people actually want at a funeral. He has a better base of ethos as well, being Caesar's best friend, and he speaks in verse, not prose, which shows his respect for the situation and that he was actually prepared for this speech. So he starts with, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Antony immediately shows that he understands the crowd, and he starts undermining Brutus straight away. He comes out to a crowd that is fully on board with Brutus and understands that they're not going to want praise for Caesar straight away. So he says that he will agree with Brutus and coming to bury Caesar as well. So he says, then the evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be Caesar. So this quote is quite nice. It's antithesis. So he says that people only remember the bad things about Caesar, and people only remember the bad things about people when they die, whereas the good things go away with them when they die. So he's saying here that he will give some of the good things that happen with Caesar. So he says, the noble Brutus hath told you that Caesar were ambitious. If it was so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously Caesar has answered it. So this is the first undermining of Brutus's nobility and his honour, as the ironic use of noble or honourable as epithets begins and will continue for the entire rest of Antony's oration. Further, there is significant Machiavellian undermining of Brutus's points, where Antony used low modality language and quantifiers like if it were true and he hath told you to cast doubt over whether what Brutus has said is actually true. Finally, we see polypototon with grieve, which is where a root word is used more than once in the same sentence. So he says it was a grievous fault and grievously Caesar hath answered it. So that's just a nice little technique if you want to chuck that in there. He says, he was my friend, faithful and just to me, but Brutus says he was ambitious and Brutus is an honourable man. This begins his main line of undermining Brutus. He says something that contests Brutus and then ironically repeats that Brutus is honourable. He uses parody of stowaway here when he turns the virtue of honour into a vice. So his honour, Brutus's honour, is now presented as a bad thing. This also sets up Antony's base of ethos, saying he was my best friend and he was always faithful and just to me. So he then says, he hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? There's anamnesis here, which we saw before in Act 1, Scene 2, which is where you give a flashback to past events. The idea is that Caesar brought Rome many prisoners, and the money in ransom that those prisoners got paid for the state, and this clearly wouldn't have been ambitious, because if Caesar was ambitious, he would have taken it for himself. Antony then says, when the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Equally on this point, Antony now paints Caesar as a saint. He is hurt when the people are hurt, and this makes Caesar sound like a god who cares so deeply for the people. This making him clearly not ambitious. He then says, which he hath thrice refused was this ambition. This is now relating back to when Antony 3 times offered Caesar the crown, and he adopts an interrogative style of speech to undermine Brutus's main points about Caesar's ambition. It becomes a disingenuous question because Antony knows the answer. He's selectively asking rhetorical questions, which the people have no choice but to answer in his favour. So he's saying, well, Caesar thrice refused the crown. This surely can't have been ambitious. He then says, I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. This again provides an appeal to ethos. He can claim that he isn't disproving Brutus. He is just saying what he knows is true. And he does know that it's true because he was best friends with Caesar. But this is also an example, which we'll see a few more times, of apophasis. Apophasis is where you bring something up, but only very briefly, basically like saying that you won't do something, so you don't actually do it, but you now put it in everybody's heads that you could do it. So he brings up that he's not going to disprove Brutus, but that puts it into everybody's head, oh, well, maybe Brutus should be disproven. And this will happen a few more times. He then says, you all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn from him? So Antony uses a bit of logical rhetoric here, asking them why they aren't willing to mourn for Caesar when they loved him just a few days ago. There is also a use of litotes here, or litotes, or it's spelled Litotes, which is like a double negative. Instead of saying you all loved him once with cause, Antony says you all loved him not without cause. So this makes it an understatement. Not only did they love him not without cause, they loved him so genuinely for so long. He then says, "O judgment." This is apostrophe, not like the little squiggle thing, but this is where you directly refer to an inanimate concept, and in this case, it's judgment. He then says, "Bear with me, my heart is there in the coffin with Caesar, and I must pause till it comes back to me." So this is more of Antony's dissembling nature. He basically starts crying in one of his most grandiose appeals to pathos. He makes the crowd pause and watch him there, showing how sad he is about Caesar's death. He then says, "But yesterday the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now he lies there, and none so poor do him reverence." So this is an appeal to the fickle nature of the people once again. Antony is saying that yesterday you all loved him, and his word could have been the most important thing in the world. But now he lies here and is reduced to nothing. He then says, "O masters, if I were so disposed to stir your hearts and minds to mutiny and rage, I should do Brutus wrong and Cassius wrong, who you all know are honourable men." This is more apophasis here. He basically says he won't stir their hearts and minds to go into mutiny and rage, but by saying that everybody knows that's actually what he wants them to do. He then ironically repeats the epithet again of them being honourable men. Now he brings up the whole point about Caesar's will. He says, "'Tis his will, let but the commons hear this testament, which, pardon me, I do not mean to read, and they would go and kiss dead Caesar's wounds, and dip their napkins in his blood, yet beg a hair of him for memory, and dying mention it within their wills." So this is a long one here, but it does make sense when we work through it. So Antony begins by bringing up Caesar's will. He says if the people had heard the will, they would be so happy with Caesar that they would go and kiss his wounds and dip napkins in his blood. And then when they die, they would include these napkins in their will. This is an anachronism because this isn't actually something they did in ancient Rome, but it was something that they did in medieval England, and the priests sort of did it. But the idea was that they would think that Caesar is so good that they would want to dip something in his blood and pass that down as a family heirloom. We also see an effort here from Antony to keep drawing the crowd in. He says that there is a will, but no, I'm not going to read it for you. And this is an example of paralepsis, which is when you say something but then just gloss over it. He then says, "You are not wood, you are not stones, but men." And this mirrors Morellus's comment from the first scene of the play, where he says, "You blocks, you stones." Antony refutes this, but he actually knows full well that they are blocks and stones, and they are fickle. He just tries to appeal to them. He then says, "Bearing the will of Caesar, it will inflame you, it will make you mad." Antony is doing nice little things here where he says, "Oh, if you knew what the will said, you would be so angry, but I'm not going to tell you what the will says." And then he says, "For if you should know, oh, what would come of it." More of the same here as Antony knows what would come of it and actually wants that, but he won't say it. He then says, "I fear I have wronged the honourable men whose daggers have stabbed Caesar. I do fear it." This is now something a bit different from Antony. He once again uses the term honourable men, but now pairs it with those whose daggers have stabbed Caesar. He's trying to remind the crowd that who did what, and that he doesn't actually care that he has wronged them. The crowd then responds by saying they were traitors, honourable men. So the crowd picks up on some sarcasm here, and they now say that the conspirators were traitors, and this is a major shift. The irony here is that the crowd have now disproved the honourable men point that Antony has made. They then say they were villains, murderers, the will, read the will. And again, that shift as the people now view the conspirators as murderers and ask Antony to read the will. This is obviously a major contrast to just a few minutes ago when they were saying Caesar's better part shall be crowned in Brutus. So now we see Antony reads the will. He starts by saying, "If you have tears, prepare to shed them now." He appeals to their pathos again and prepares for them to be emotionally shocked about the news. He then goes on talking a bit about Caesar's body and says, "See what a rent the envious Casca made." This is an interesting shift from Antony here, as the epithets which he'd previously said he called all the conspirators honourable or good men have now changed to envious Casca. He has changed his language a lot in line with what the crowd is now agreeing with. He then says, "Judge, O you gods, how dearly Caesar loved him. This was the most unkindest cut of all." This is where Antony brings forward mainly the point of betrayal. He tries to hit home really that Caesar loved Brutus so much, and Brutus brutally betrayed Caesar, and this was the most painful cut for Caesar. He then says, "Oh, what a fall there was, my countrymen. Then I and you and all of us fell down while bloody treason flourished over us." So Antony now says to the crowd through cumulative listing that as their leader fell, as Caesar fell, they all fell. He also now uses the term treason to describe what the conspirators did. So as we can see, Antony's language just shifts so much throughout his oration. It starts by saying, "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him," and by the end, he's calling the conspirators traitors. So the crowd's response to Antony's oration is huge. One of the best lines that you'll use for this, it's a bit hard to remember all the different parts, but they say, revenge about, seek, burn, kill, slay, let not a traitor live. So this is asyndetic lifting here from the crowd to show their pure rage due to Antony's words. Antony then sort of tries to rein it back in and says, let me not stir you up to such a sudden flood of mutiny. They that have done these deeds are honourable. This is more of that irony, even more so now as everybody knows that they're not honourable, but Antony's just still repeating it. He then says, I am no orator, as Brutus is. This is an understatement here, or litotes again. Obviously, Antony actually is an excellent orator, as he's just proven, but he comments that he isn't just, I don't know, for a bit of fun. He then says, for I have neither wit nor words, nor worth, action nor utterance, nor the power of speech, nor to stir men's blood. There's more litotes here with the repetition of nor. He's trying to say to the crowd that he's not an orator, so he can't possibly be manipulating them, because he doesn't know how to. But because he's not an orator, what he's saying must just be the plain truth, not any form of manipulation. And then he says, the stones of Rome to rise and mutiny. This is the final apophasis. He says that if Brutus were, that if he were Brutus and Brutus were him, Brutus would stir them all to mutiny. Basically, he says that he wants them to mutiny, and the crowd respond with, we'll mutiny. So there you go. There's the funeral oration scene, most important scene in the play. I hope a lot of those quotes were helpful, but the most important things you want to bring out of that scene are just the sheer contrast between, firstly, Brutus's speech and Antony's speech, because you can draw a lot of differences between them, but then you can also draw a lot of contrast between the end of Antony's speech and the start of Antony's speech. Obviously, he starts off, as I said, with all those nice things, saying things like, the noble Brutus hath told you that Caesar was ambitious. If it was so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously Caesar has answered it. And he says, for Brutus is an honourable man, so are they all honourable men. And obviously we know that those are irony from Antony there, but at least to the crowd, it sounds somewhat genuine to start with. And then at the end he says, he calls them traitors. So that's the big thing to remember there. We're now going to move on to Act 3, Scene 3, which is actually quite an important scene, especially if you're talking about the extent to which Antony's speech was effective. So the main events of this scene is where Cinna the poet is questioned by the plebeians, and then Cinna is killed. So the characters involved are Cinna the poet, who is basically in here to make the point of how enraged the crowd is. He's not at all involved in the conspiracy, but the key link here is that there is a conspirator called Cinna. They're not the same person. Cinna the poet's completely different, and he's completely innocent, hasn't done anything wrong, but the crowd basically don't care. And then also the mob of the plebeians are involved. So in terms of the context here, right after Antony's oration, he's managed to rile up an angry mob. This mob is charging through the streets to kill or attack the conspirators, and they come across Cinna the poet. They ask him questions, and then when they find out that his name is Cinna, which is the same as one of the conspirators, they decide to kill him. This is evidence basically just of how angry Antony has made the mob. So in terms of some quotes and analysis here, the quote is, what is your name? Whither are you going? Where do you dwell? Are you married or a bachelor? Answer every man directly. So the four plebeians here question Cinna. They are looking for any people at all associated with the conspiracy, and so essentially interrogate him. He says, directly, I'm going to see Caesar's funeral. They ask, as a friend or an enemy? And he says, as a friend. Cinna directly tells the men that he is going to Caesar's funeral as a friend, something a conspirator would obviously not do. He then says, truly my name is Cinna. He tells them that his name is Cinna, and this is the same as a name as one of the conspirators. They respond by saying, tear him to pieces, he's a conspirator. Thus, they say that he must die purely because he has the same name as one of the conspirators. They say, tear him for his bad verses. He says, I am Cinna the poet. Again, Cinna defends himself and makes it clear that he's not a conspirator. And the plebeians say, it is no matter. His name's Cinna. Pluck but his name out of his heart and turn him going. Essentially, they say, we don't care, your name is Cinna, so you deserve to die. So Cinna is then killed, and they end and say, to Brutus's, to Cassius's, burn all, some to Decius's, and some to Casca's. Essentially, the mob decide that they're going to go to each of the conspirators' houses and burn everything. This showing their intensity. So that's the end of Act 3. Obviously, that's like pretty much our most important act in the play, because it's where Caesar's killed. It's basically where everything happened. But we're now going to move on to Act 4, and we've got a few quite nice scenes here for Act 4. So I'm going to start off with Act 4, Scene 1, and then skip Act 4, Scene 2, because basically nothing happens, and then obviously move on to Act 4, Scene 3. So, Act 4, Scene 1, also known as the prescription scene. This is a very important scene, so make sure you're taking note of what's going on here. So in terms of a scene summary here, as I just said, this is the prescription scene. So Antony, Lepidus, and Octavius discuss who must die. They then send Lepidus away to fetch the will from Caesar's house, and Octavius and Antony discuss that they plan to kill Lepidus, or just basically let him go. Antony and Octavius then speak about the threat of Brutus and Cassius. So in terms of the characters involved, we've got Antony, we obviously know who he is, and then we have Octavius, who is a member of the second triumvirate, which is their little group of three, and he will eventually be the absolute ruler of Rome. And then we have Lepidus, who is a member of the second triumvirate as well, who will eventually be killed by Antony when they decide they don't need him anymore. So in terms of context at the time, the men are discussing who must be killed after they have taken control of the country. Lepidus says that Antony's son-in-law must die, and Octavius said that Lepidus' brother must die as well. They both agree, and then Lepidus is sent away to go and get the will from Caesar's house. The others then plan to get rid of him when they don't need him. Brutus and Cassius are away in Asia to get an army together, and so now the triumvirate needs some money for their army, so they decide to steal it. So in terms of quotes and analysis for this scene, a few of these are quite important, and the main point of this scene is to show the duplicitous nature of Antony in his public versus private life. He's just come through in this oration, and he's been all nice about everything and said, oh, he cares for the people so much like Caesar did, and now in this scene he works out how to steal some of the money from the will to fund his army. So he starts by saying, these many men shall die, their names are pricked. So they say a lot of people will die, essentially, over 100 senators, and they are written down as people who must die, and their names are pricked. So that's how a prescription worked. Essentially, it was a list of people who would be killed, and basically they were killed if you were put on the list. So then Octavius says to Lepidus, your brother too must die, consent you, Lepidus. And Octavius makes sure that Lepidus is okay with his brother dying, and Lepidus says, yeah, that's okay. But then he also says that Mark Antony's son-in-law shall die, and Mark Antony agrees with this and says, he shall not live, with a spot I damn him. And so he says, yep, sure. He's commanding in front of Lepidus, and it immediately shows that Lepidus is cleared below Antony, which obviously shouldn't happen in an equal triumvirate. So Antony is portrayed as commanding and in charge, and he knows what he's doing. Lepidus, completely the opposite. He's just sort of there. Then Antony says to Lepidus, fetch the will hither, and we shall determine how to cut off some charge in legacies. So Antony now asks Lepidus to go away and get the will of Caesar, and they want to work out how they will steal some money, which is cut off some charge from Caesar's will to fund their army. So this is a direct contrast to the point where Antony promises the people of Rome the will of Caesar and says, you will compel me then to read the will. So then we see that Antony and Octavius, after Lepidus has just gone, they discuss that Lepidus should basically be cut off from the triumvirate. So Antony opens by saying, is it fit that the threefold world divided, he should stand as one of the three to share it? Antony basically says, well, we're going to divide the world in three because we're a triumvirate. But if we're going to divide it into three, should he really be one of the people who gets a third of Rome? Like, really? And they say no. They say they should get rid of him instead and split it in two. And then Antony gives more quotes where he says, and having brought our treasure ware, we will then take down his load and turn him off to shake his ears and graze in commons. So this is now the start of an extended metaphor of Lepidus being like Antony's horse. He says that as soon as Lepidus is finished carrying all their treasure, being useful, they will turn him off and send him away. And then he backs this up by saying, it is a creature that I teach to fight, to wind, to stop, to run directly on. His corporal governed by my spirit. There's asyndetic listing here from Antony. He says that Lepidus is like Antony's sport. Antony's horse, sorry. Antony teaches him to do things and uses him for things, but he is governed by Antony's spirit. And then Antony says, do not talk of him, but as property. Finally, again, Lepidus is used as a tool and should be used and then ditched. He's property, not a person. The pair finally discuss the threat of Brutus and Cassius. So, they say Brutus and Cassius are levying powers, we must straight ahead. Essentially, they're a growing threat and the pair must move. And then Octavius finally says, and some that smile in their hearts, I fear millions of mischief. So he now says that he's fearful that many people who look nice to them and have smiles are actually against them. So that is Act 4, Scene 1, that's the prescription scene. So some of the stuff really up the top and in the middle about cutting off Lepidus and also taking money from Caesar's will is the most important stuff there. So now we're moving on to Act 4, Scene 3. As I said, nothing really happens in Act 4, Scene 2, so I've just skipped that. In terms of the main events of the scene here, Cassius and Brutus have a big emotion-filled quarrel, and then also the ghost of Caesar shows up to haunt Brutus. So the characters involved here are Brutus, Cassius, and Caesar's ghost. So in terms of the context at the time, Brutus and Cassius are in Asia trying to raise an army. Cassius has been pragmatic and has tried to take bribes to raise money from the army, but Brutus has just prosecuted somebody else for taking bribes, which is dumb because Cassius says they're not in Rome, so they don't actually need to worry about their idealism and should be pragmatic, even though Brutus says, no, we can't do that. We still have to be idealistic. So eventually they fight a lot and then they forgive each other and make up. And then Caesar's ghost shows up, so that's nice. So in the first bit, Cassius says to Brutus, you wronged yourself to write in such a case. Cassius is mad at Brutus and saying, you wronged me because you condemned somebody for taking bribes, even though they should take bribes to be pragmatic. Here, Brutus says instead that it was Cassius's fault. Brutus says, I'd rather be a dog and bay at the moon than such a Roman. So this is a metaphor here from Brutus where he says that he would rather be a dog that howls at the moon than be a Roman who takes bribes. This shows his rigid idealism more and more. He then says, away, slight man. Now Brutus is basically just being mean. This basically means go away, you small man, which he says to Cassius. And then he says, must I budge? Must I observe you? Must I stand and crouch under your testy humour? There's a repetition of rhetorical questions here, which become part of their arguments. Then Cassius says, a friend should bear his friend's infirmities, but Brutus makes mine greater than they are. Cassius now says that as a friend, Brutus should deal with Cassius's flaws. Brutus not only doesn't do that, but he makes them bigger than they actually are. Brutus responds to this by saying, I do not like your faults. And then Cassius says, a friendly eye could never see such faults. Brutus then says that he doesn't like Cassius's faults, and Cassius says that Brutus, as a real friend, would never be able to see those faults. Brutus responds with, a flatterers would not, though they do appear as huge as high Olympus. This is a metaphor here. Brutus in response says, no, only a flatterer wouldn't see those faults, but your faults are as big as Olympus. So obviously, Brutus is just being really annoying and not very nice to Cassius there, but eventually they make up. Now we see that Caesar's ghost shows up and talks to Brutus. So he says, so Brutus senses that something's there and says, art thou anything? Art thou some gods, some angel, or some devil that makest my blood cold and my hair dare to stare? So this is where Brutus first sees and acknowledges the ghost. And we see that this is mostly an allusion to European ideals. We know that no Romans would have been concerned about the devil or an angel, but the European audience clearly would be. So you could maybe say that this is meta-theatricality. The ghost then says, to tell thee, thou shalt see me at Philippi. So Philippi is where the battle will take place, and the ghost is telling him that he will see Brutus at the battle. This does two things. Firstly, it shows that the battle is doomed. As we all know, when a ghost shows up in a Shakespeare's play, it means that God is now against Brutus, and he's basically cooked. But secondly, this is equivocatory language from the ghost, and he does well here, because when he says that Brutus will see him at Philippi, he means he will see the ghost there when he dies at Philippi. Like, he will see the ghost in heaven when he's in Philippi. So it's quite smart from the ghost, nice little language there. And then Brutus responds with, why I will see thee at Philippi then. Here we almost see Brutus concede with the ghost. He now knows what he did was wrong and has almost resigned to himself to the fact that he's going to be haunted, meaning that the decision to Caesar can't possibly have been correct and he thus must die. So that's everything that we've got for Act 4. Now we're on to the final act of the play, Act 5. I can tell you it's getting really sort of tiring in here. I'm feeling a bit lightheaded, so hopefully I don't faint halfway through this last bit. But anyway, final act of the play. I'm going to go through scene 1, and then what I've written is just sort of the rest, because there's actually 5 scenes in Act 5, and half of them don't really matter that much. So I've synthesized them all down into sort of one little bit. So Act 5, Scene 1. So the main events of the scene here are that Antony and Octavius argue with each other. Then we see Brutus and Cassius meet up with them, and the pairs basically have a screaming match at each other. We then see that they separate, and Cassius speaks to Messala, who's one of their generals, about omens that they've seen. And then we see at the end Brutus and Cassius say their goodbyes, which are actually quite nice. So the characters involved here are Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Octavius, and Messala. So in terms of the context at the time, so the war between Brutus and Cassius, and then Octavius and Antony is about to begin, and the men have a meeting before this battle. In this meeting, they argue and basically just hurl insults at each other, and we then see Cassius speak to Messala, who's one of their generals, about the omens he has seen. And even though he doesn't believe in omens, he now thinks that the battle may be doomed. Finally, Cassius and Brutus say their goodbyes to each other, and the battle commences. So firstly, Antony and Octavius argue. We've just got one quote here, it's really short. So Antony says, upon the left hand of the even field, and then Octavius responds with, upon the right hand. So the pair are trying to work out who should go and have their army situated on which side. The right side is the more prestigious of the two, and Antony tells Octavius to thus go on the left. Octavius says, nah, I'm going on the right, you can go on the left, which shows a slight breakdown in their relationship and alludes to the fact that they might not actually be all that peaceful. Now we see that Brutus and Cassius come over and they basically have a screaming match. So, Brutus opens by saying, words before blows, is it so, countrymen? So Brutus is saying here that he's questioning the fact that they're having a discussion before they fight. And Octavius hits back and says, not that we love words better as you do. Octavius responds basically by saying, we don't love words more than fighting like you do, Brutus. And then Brutus says, well, good words are better than bad strokes, Octavius. So his idea here is that using words is better than doing a bad job of using force, like he's suggesting that Octavius and Antony do. But then Antony says, in your bad strokes, Brutus, you give good words. Antony's throwing a lot of shade on Brutus here and basically saying that his good words, which were a nice speech, that came along with his bad strokes and his evil strokes of killing Caesar. Cassius then hits at Antony here and says, the posture of your blows are yet unknown, but for your words they rob the hydra bees and leave them honeyless. Cassius says that Antony and the blows he can inflict aren't yet known, but his words are so sweet that they rob the bees of their honey. He's trying to highlight Antony's hypocrisy. If Brutus is so evil after giving nice words, then Antony must be doing very evil things. Alright, so then they've had enough of their fun debate there, and now we move on to the next part of the scene, which is where Cassius speaks to Messala, who is one of their generals. So a quick note here, Cassius is an Epicurean. So this means that he aligns himself with the beliefs of Epicurus, who is a philosopher who basically said nothing is up to fate and everything is about our decisions. He didn't believe in the idea of the divine right of kings or the intervention of gods in the natural world, and thus he didn't believe in things like omens, and neither did Cassius. So Cassius opens speaking to Messala by saying, you know that I held Epicurus strong and his opinion, now I change my mind. Cassius tells Messala that as strong as he held Epicurus in his mind, he now doesn't necessarily believe it anymore. He says 2 mighty eagles fell. Cassius has seen the omen of 2 eagles falling, which he believes he cannot ignore. He then says, and in their steads do ravens, crows, and kites fly over our heads and downward look on us. Replacing the eagles were 3 birds who eat dead things, so that obviously being like ravens and crows, eat things that have died. And he's saying that they look down upon their army, which is once again a bad omen. He finally says their shadows seem a canopy most fatal, under which our army lies, ready to give up the ghost. Basically, the avian imagery or the bird imagery here is that Cassius is saying that their armies are basically under a canopy of death, which puts them there ready to die. He recognizes the omens. Now we see Cassius and Brutus say their goodbyes. So Cassius opens by asking Brutus if they lose the battle, will Brutus be taken home to Rome as a prisoner? Brutus says, no, Cassius, no. Think not, thy noble Roman, that ever Brutus will go bound to Rome. Brutus says, I would rather die here to protect my honour than go home to Rome as a prisoner. And this once again reinforces his rigid idealism, saying that he would never go to Rome as a prisoner and he would rather die. This links up with, I love the name of honour more than I fear death, back from Act 1, Scene 2. He then says, forever and forever farewell, Cassius. If we do meet again, why, we shall smile. If not, why then this parting was well made. Brutus is saying goodbye. He says if we survive and we win, then we'll laugh that we ever had this conversation. But if not, then we did do well. Cassius responds by saying, forever and forever farewell, Brutus. If we do meet again, we will smile indeed. If not, 'tis true this parting was well made. Cassius mirrors this goodbye and they part as 2 good men. Now that is the last time they will ever speak to each other, as we will see in Scene the Rest, which I've titled it. So this is the rest of the play, the next 4 scenes. There are a few of them, like Act 5, Scene 2, that literally go for all about 5 lines. And so I can summarize all of the rest of the next scenes in not all that much. So the main events of the scene here, so Cassius's army is taken over by Antony's army, just as Brutus's army takes over Octavius's army. We then see Cassius kills himself. Brutus's army is then now taken over by Antony's army, and then Brutus kills himself. And then Antony and Octavius close the play by showing their respect for Brutus. So the characters involved now are Antony, Octavius, Brutus, Cassius, and Strato. So in terms of the context at the time, the battle commences and ends throughout this period. So Cassius has his army defeated by Antony. At the same time, Brutus takes over Octavius's army. Cassius thinks that they've lost the whole battle when his army is taken over, so he kills himself. Brutus is then eventually defeated by Antony's forces and has to go into hiding. There he runs upon his sword, killing himself as well. Then the play closes with Antony and Octavius having their final words and showing their respect for Brutus. So, the first few things in terms of our quotes and analysis are above. There aren't really quotes that you're going to need for them because you're not really going to be talking about those things. Just having a knowledge of them is important. So Brutus ending his life here, we see Fly, my lord, fly is the line Clitus knows that Brutus has to die and tells him to fly and run away or he will be taken by Antony. Brutus then says, hold my sword and turn away thy face while I run upon it. He says to Strato, who is one of his basically closest advisors, please hold my sword and I will run upon it. This is him saying that he will kill himself. Then he says, farewell, good Strato, Caesar, now be still. I killed not thee with half so good a will. So Brutus dies here and tells Caesar to be still. He says that he kills himself far more willingly than when he killed Caesar and acknowledges that it was a more noble act. He dies repeating his honour, which again shows his rigid idealism. But he's sort of saying here that he's far more willing to kill himself than he was to kill Caesar, basically saying to Caesar he understands that what he did was the wrong thing and in the end it's not going to matter and it all went badly anyway. So now Antony and Octavius close the play and they speak about Brutus. So Antony says, referring to Brutus, he says this was the noblest Roman of them all. Antony gives a final epithet here of Brutus, once again saying he was honourable and noble, and you could argue that he was being ironic here or that he wasn't sincere, but I genuinely think he was sincere in this comment. He then says all the conspirators, save only he, did what they did in envy of great Caesar. Antony says that Brutus was the most noble Roman, as the other conspirators killed Caesar out of jealousy for him, like Cassius did. But Brutus killed him because he genuinely thought that was the right thing to do by the people of Rome and Rome itself. Octavius then says, with all respect and rights of burial, most like a soldier ordered honourably. He says that he repeats the sentiment of Antony and says that Brutus should be buried in a noble way, like a respected soldier would be. He deserves that because he was a genuinely noble and honourable person. And he finally gives the last line of the play where he says, so call the field to rest and let's away to part the glories of this happy day. Octavius gives the final words of the play here and tells the soldiers to go home so they can all leave and take the glories of their happy day. So that is it. That is all of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. I really hope you enjoyed. I know it was very long. I do hope that the stuff that I said in the intro at the start, where if you're in a bit of a rush and you're able to jump from scene to scene, I really hope that was helpful. If you are somehow at the end and you've watched the entire video, that's incredibly impressive, and we really thank you for that. And I hope you enjoyed. I hope it was helpful. I put a lot of work into these notes, so I'm really glad that we've been able to hopefully help people. If you did enjoy the video, leave a like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. And yeah, it really means a lot. So that's all from me on another Shakespeare play. Hopefully I get at least another year off before I have to make another one of these videos. So thank you everybody and goodbye.